The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the departure terminal of Denver International Airport, casting their familiar sterile glow across rows of black plastic chairs and hurried travelers. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the kind of hour when most people moved through the world with purpose, but little awareness of those around them. Coffee shops were beginning their morning rush. Gate agents were preparing for the day's first flights, and the steady stream of passengers created that particular airport symphony of rolling luggage wheels, muffled announcements, and distant conversations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In this ordinary scene, among hundreds of travelers focused on their own journeys, few would have noticed the woman sitting quietly near gate B12. She wore a navy blazer over dark slacks, her hair pulled back in a simple but professional style. No entourage surrounded her, no security detail hovered nearby, and no obvious signs marked her as anyone particularly noteworthy. She sat with a legal briefcase at her feet, occasionally glancing at her phone, but mostly observing the morning choreography of airline travel with the patient composure of someone accustomed to waiting. Pam Bondi had learned long ago that anonymity could be a gift. In her years as a prosecutor and later in public service, she had grown weary of the constant scrutiny, the cameras that seemed to materialize whenever she stepped into public view, and the way every mundane activity could become fodder for commentary. This morning, traveling to a legal conference in Phoenix, she had deliberately chosen an early flight specifically to avoid the crowds and attention that came with peak travel times. She wanted nothing more than a quiet journey, time to review her presentation notes, and perhaps a moment of peace before stepping back into the public arena. The morning had been proceeding exactly as she had hoped. Her flight was on time, the terminal was relatively calm, and she had managed to find a seat away from the main thoroughfare where she could work undisturbed. She had pulled out a stack of legal documents and was making notes in the margins when she first noticed the commotion near the coffee stand about 50 yards away. It started as most airport disturbances do, with raised voices that gradually cut through the ambient noise. At first, she paid little attention, assuming it was the typical traveler frustration over delayed flights or long lines. But as the voices grew louder and more insistent, something about the tone made her look up from her papers. There was an aggressive quality to the exchange, a confrontational edge that seemed disproportionate to any normal airport grievance. She could see a small crowd beginning to form near the coffee shop, passengers slowing their pace to observe whatever was unfolding. A man in an expensive suit was gesticulating emphatically at what appeared to be a young airport employee, his voice carrying across the terminal with an unmistakable air of superiority and indignation. Even from a distance, his body language spoke of someone accustomed to getting his way through force of personality, rather than courtesy. Pam recognized the type immediately. In her years in legal and political circles, she had encountered countless individuals who wielded their perceived status like a weapon, who treated service workers as beneath their consideration, and who seemed to believe that raising their voice automatically granted them authority. The sight made her uncomfortable in a way that went beyond simple disapproval. It reminded her of everything she had come to dislike about public life, the casual cruelty that power sometimes enabled, and the way decent people could be made to feel small by those who mistook aggression for strength. The young woman behind the coffee counter appeared to be no more than 20, probably a college student working an early morning shift to pay for her education. Her uniform was crisp and clean, her hair neatly pulled back, and even from across the terminal, Pam could see the way she was trying to maintain her professional composure while dealing with what was clearly an unreasonable customer. The girl's shoulders were tense, her movements quick and nervous, and she kept glancing around as if hoping someone might intervene, or at least that the confrontation would end quickly. But it wasn't ending. If anything, the man's agitation seemed to be escalating. His voice rose another octave, and Pam caught fragments of his complaints carried on the airport's recycled air. Something about the coffee being wrong, about incompetent service, about not knowing who he was. The words themselves were less important than the tone. the casual dismissal of another human being's dignity, the assumption that his inconvenience justified public humiliation of someone who was simply trying to do her job. Pam felt a familiar tension building in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced countless times when witnessing injustice. It was the prosecutor in her, the part of her that had spent years advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. She had built her career on the principle that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their station in life. And watching this public display of arrogance triggered every protective instinct she possessed. The crowd around the coffee stand was growing larger, but rather than deterring the man's behavior, the audience seemed to embolden him. He turned partially toward the gathering onlookers, as if seeking validation for his outrage, his voice taking on the performative quality of someone who believed himself to be righteously wronged. He gestured broadly, his movements theatrical and designed to command attention rather than resolve whatever issue had initially prompted his complaint. Pam set down her pen and watched more intently. The young woman behind the counter was now visibly shaking, her professional smile faltering as she tried to process whatever demand was being made of her. She kept looking toward what Pam assumed was a manager's office, but no help seemed to be forthcoming. The other customers in line had backed away, some recording the scene with their phones, others simply trying to distance themselves from the unpleasantness. It was then that Pam noticed something that made her blood run cold. The man had pulled out his own phone and was now pointing it directly at the young employee. While continuing his tirade, he wasn't just berating her anymore. He was documenting it, creating a record of her distress for reasons that Pam could only assume were malicious. The girl's eyes went wide with panic as she realized she was being recorded, and her hands began to tremble as she tried to continue preparing orders. While being subjected to this digital harassment, the scene crystallized everything Pam found reprehensible about the current state of public discourse. Here was someone using their platform and privilege to torment a working person, creating content out of human suffering and treating another person's dignity as expendable for the sake of whatever narrative they were constructing. It was bullying disguised as journalism, cruelty masquerading as righteous indignation. She stood up slowly, her legal training kicking in as she assessed the situation. This wasn't just rudeness or poor behavior, depending on the circumstances. It could constitute harassment, intimidation, or even assault if the young woman felt threatened. At the very least, it was a clear violation of basic human decency. And Pam had spent too many years fighting for justice to simply sit by and watch it unfold. The man was now waving his phone aggressively, using it almost like a weapon as he continued his verbal assault on the coffee shop employee. His voice had taken on a mocking tone, and Pam could hear him questioning the girl's competence, her intelligence, and her worthiness to serve customers. Each word was calculated to wound, designed to break down whatever composure she had left. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Pam gathered her briefcase and stood, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had learned long ago that the most effective interventions were often the calmest ones. That authority came not from volume but from presence. As she began walking toward the coffee stand, she could feel her prosecutor instinct sharpening, her mind automatically cataloging the elements of what she was witnessing and formulating the most effective response. The closer she got to the scene, the more appalling the man's behavior became. He was now making personal attacks on the young woman's appearance and intelligence, his phone still recording as he created what could only be described as a public humiliation video. The girl was close to tears, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate the espresso machine. While onlookers continued to film the spectacle rather than intervene, Pam felt a surge of protective anger unlike anything she had experienced in years. This was exactly the kind of abuse of power that had driven her to public service. In the first place, the use of privilege and platform to harm those who couldn't fight back. She quickened her pace, her jaw set with determination. As she approached the edge of the crowd, she could finally see the man clearly for the first time. He was impeccably dressed in what was obviously an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled and his posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Everything about his appearance suggested success and sophistication, which made his treatment of the young employee even more despicable. This wasn't someone acting out of desperation or distress. This was calculated cruelty performed by someone who should have known better. The realization of who he was hit her like a physical blow. She had seen that face on television countless times, had watched him grandstand in press conferences and congressional hearings, had observed his particular brand of aggressive journalism that often seemed more focused on creating confrontation than seeking truth. Jim Acosta, the CNN correspondent who had built his reputation on adversarial questioning and theatrical displays of righteous indignation. But this wasn't a press conference or a political event. This was a coffee shop in an airport, and his target wasn't a public official who had signed up for scrutiny, but a young service worker who was simply trying to do her job. The disconnect between his public persona as a defender of democracy and his private behavior towards someone with no power to fight back was staggering in its hypocrisy. Pam paused for a moment, allowing the full scope of the situation to register. She was about to confront one of the most recognizable faces in political journalism, someone who commanded significant influence and had built his career on aggressive confrontation. She knew that any interaction between them would likely be recorded, analyzed, and dissected in the court of public opinion. The prudent thing would be to turn around, return to her seat, and avoid any unnecessary complications. But as she watched Acosta continue his assault on the young woman, now demanding that she call her manager while still recording her obvious distress, Pam knew she couldn't walk away. This wasn't about politics or media. It was about basic human decency. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the difficult thing, and her father had taught her long ago that character was defined by what you did when no one was watching and nothing was to be gained. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped forward into what she knew would be one of the most challenging confrontations of her life. The morning air in the terminal seemed to thicken as Pam approached the increasingly volatile scene. At the coffee stand, what had begun as a simple customer complaint had devolved into something far more sinister, a public spectacle that was causing genuine distress to everyone involved. The young barista was now openly crying, her tears making it nearly impossible for her to see what she was doing as she tried desperately to fulfill whatever impossible demand Acosta was making of her. Pam positioned herself at the edge of the crowd, taking a moment to observe the full scope of what was happening. Acosta had his phone held high, clearly recording everything. While he continued his verbal barrage, his voice carried that particular tone of manufactured outrage that she had heard so many times in press conferences, the performative indignation that seemed designed more for the cameras than for any genuine grievance. "This is exactly what's wrong with this country," he was saying, his voice projecting across the terminal with practiced authority. "Incompetence everywhere you look, people who can't do the simplest jobs correctly, and then they act like victims when they're called out for their failures." He gestured dramatically with his free hand while keeping his phone trained on the girl's face. "This is the real America, folks. This is what we're dealing with." The young woman behind the counter was visibly trembling now, her professional composure completely shattered. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, probably working her way through college with this early morning shift, and she was being subjected to a level of public humiliation that seemed designed to break her spirit. Her name tag read Sarah, and Pam could see that she was trying to speak, trying to apologize or explain. But Acosta kept talking over her, drowning out her voice with his continuing commentary. "I asked for a simple coffee modification," he continued, his tone growing more condescending with each word. "Something any competent person should be able to handle. But instead, I get attitude, excuses, and incompetence. And when I try to address it civilly, I'm treated like the problem." He turned slightly toward his phone camera, addressing his future audience directly. "This is the entitlement mentality that's destroying our service industry. No accountability, no standards, no respect for customers who are paying their salaries." Pam felt her hands clench involuntarily as she listened to this twisted narrative. She could see from her vantage point that Sarah had prepared what looked like a perfectly acceptable coffee drink, and whatever modification Acosta had requested was clearly either unreasonable or impossible given the equipment available. But more importantly, even if there had been a legitimate mistake, nothing justified this level of public harassment and humiliation. The crowd around them was growing larger, drawn by the commotion and the familiar face of the CNN correspondent. Some people were recording the scene with their own phones, creating multiple angles of what was becoming a viral moment in real time. Others were whispering among themselves, trying to figure out what had started the confrontation. A few seemed uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but were either too intimidated or too uncertain to intervene. Pam noticed that none of the airport security personnel had appeared yet, despite the growing disturbance. The coffee shop manager was nowhere to be seen, leaving Sarah to face this assault entirely alone. It was a perfect example of how institutions often failed to protect the most vulnerable people. In moments of crisis, how those with power could create chaos while those without it were left to absorb the consequences. Acosta was now expanding his commentary to include broader social and political themes, using this young woman's distress as a launching pad for the kind of sweeping generalizations that had made him famous. "This is what happens when we lower standards," he proclaimed, still recording. "When we stop demanding excellence and start accepting mediocrity. This young woman is a symbol of everything that's gone wrong with American work ethic. The casual cruelty of using someone's genuine distress as a prop for political theater made Pam's stomach turn. She had seen enough politicians and media figures exploit human suffering for their own gain, but witnessing it this directly, seeing the immediate impact on an innocent person, crystallized her disgust in a way that years of political observation had not. Sarah was now sobbing openly, her tears falling onto the counter as she tried to continue working. Her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped a cup, sending coffee splashing across the floor and her uniform. The sound of breaking ceramic seemed to energize Acosta, who immediately zoomed in with his camera to capture her moment of complete breakdown. "And there we have it," he announced with obvious satisfaction, "the complete inability to handle even the slightest pressure or criticism. This is what passes for professionalism in today's America." He turned his camera toward the growing crowd of onlookers. "Everyone can see this. Everyone can witness what we're dealing with here." That was the moment Pam knew she couldn't wait any longer. The scene had crossed every line of human decency, and someone needed to intervene before this young woman suffered any more psychological damage. She stepped forward, her movement calm but purposeful, and positioned herself directly between Acosta and the coffee counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms and legislative chambers. "I think that's quite enough." Acosta looked up from his phone, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized her face. For just a moment, his performative confidence faltered, replaced by the calculating look of someone trying to assess a new and unexpected variable in his carefully orchestrated scene. But the pause lasted only seconds before his media instincts kicked in, and his expression shifted to one of aggressive curiosity. Well, he said, turning his camera toward her with obvious excitement. "Look who we have here. Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General and Trump loyalist." His voice took on the tone he typically reserved for hostile interviews, loaded with implication and barely concealed contempt. "And what brings you to defend incompetence this morning? Are you going to tell us that this kind of service is acceptable?" Pam remained perfectly still, her expression calm and controlled despite the adrenaline she could feel coursing through her system. She had been in confrontations with hostile media before, but never quite like this, never in defense of someone who had no ability to fight back. The stakes felt different, more personal, more immediate. "I'm here," she said evenly, "because what you're doing is wrong. This young woman is trying to do her job, and you're subjecting her to harassment and public humiliation for what appears to be your own entertainment." Acosta's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a reporter who sensed a bigger story developing. He adjusted his phone to capture both of them in the frame, his body language shifting into the aggressive stance. that had made him famous in White House press briefings. Harassment, he repeated, his voice rising with mock indignation. I'm documenting poor service and lack of accountability. That's called journalism. Something you might not understand given your history with press freedom. The personal attack was clearly designed to provoke a reaction, to goad her into the kind of heated exchange that would make for compelling video content. Pam recognized the tactic immediately, having watched Acosta deploy it countless times against political figures who had made the mistake of engaging with him on his terms. But she also knew that responding to his provocation would only escalate the situation and potentially make things worse for Sarah, who was still standing behind the counter in obvious distress. This isn't journalism, Pam replied calmly, refusing to take the bait. This is bullying. You're using your platform and your camera to intimidate someone who has no way to defend herself. That's not holding anyone accountable. That's abuse of power. The accusation clearly stung, and Acosta's composure slipped slightly. His face flushed red, and his voice took on a sharper edge. Abuse of power. He sputtered. That's rich coming from someone who spent years enabling actual abuse of power. At least I'm exposing the truth instead of covering it up. Pam felt the familiar sensation of being drawn into a political argument, the kind of ideological sparring that had defined so much of her public life. But she forced herself to stay focused on the immediate situation, on the young woman who was still crying behind the counter, on the crowd of people who were witnessing this entire exchange and recording it for posterity. The truth, she said, her voice remaining steady despite her growing anger. The truth is that you're a grown man with a national platform using it to torment a teenager who's trying to earn money for college. The truth is that you've turned someone's workplace into your personal theater for whatever point you're trying to make. The truth is that this isn't about coffee or service. It's about your need for attention and content. The words hit their mark, and Pam could see Acosta's jaw tighten as he processed the challenge to his narrative. He was accustomed to being able to control the framing of his confrontations, to position himself as the righteous truth teller facing down corrupt authority. But here, in this context, with his target being an innocent service worker, the dynamics were completely different. You don't know what you're talking about. He shot back, his professional veneer starting to crack. I have every right to document poor service and hold people accountable for their actions. That's what real journalists do, even if you don't like the results. Accountable, Pam repeated, her voice carrying a note of incredulous anger. She's a barista, not a public official. She's not accountable to you or your audience for anything other than trying to make coffee. And even if she had made a mistake, nothing justifies this level of public humiliation. The exchange was drawing even more attention now, with passengers stopping to watch what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation between two recognizable public figures. Pam could see airport security personnel finally beginning to take notice of the disturbance, their radios crackling as they communicated with their supervisors about the developing situation. Acosta seemed to sense that the narrative was slipping away from him, that his carefully constructed performance was being undermined by someone who refused to play by his rules. His response was to double down, to escalate his aggression in the hope of regaining control of the story. Listen here, he said, stepping closer to Pam and pointing his camera directly at her face. You don't get to lecture me about journalism or accountability. Your entire career has been about protecting the powerful and silencing their critics. So forgive me if I don't take ethics lessons from someone who spent years covering up for corruption. The personal nature of the attack was clearly designed to provoke an emotional response, to goad Pam into the kind of heated exchange that would make for viral video content. But it also revealed something important about Acosta's character, his willingness to abandon any pretense of professionalism when his authority was challenged. Pam took a deep breath, drawing on years of courtroom experience to maintain her composure in the face of deliberate provocation. She could feel the eyes of dozens of people on her, could see the phones recording every word and gesture, could sense that this moment would likely be dissected and analyzed across social media within hours. But more importantly, she could see Sarah behind the counter, still crying, still trapped in this nightmare that had been created for someone else's benefit. "My career," she said quietly, "has been about protecting people who can't protect themselves. And right now, that includes protecting this young woman from your harassment." She gestured towards Sarah without taking her eyes off Acosta. "Whatever point you think you're making, whatever content you think you're creating, it's not worth destroying someone's sense of safety and dignity at their workplace." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, creating a brief silence that felt profound after the escalating volume of their exchange. In that pause, Pam could hear Sarah's quiet sobs, could see the discomfort of the crowd around them, could feel the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. It was then that she noticed the airport security officers approaching, their presence adding a new dimension to an already complex situation. She realized that what had started as her attempt to protect an innocent person was about to become something much larger and more complicated, with consequences that none of them could fully predict. But as she looked at Sarah's tear-stained face and then back at Acosta's aggressive posture, Pam knew that she had made the right choice. Sometimes standing up for what was right meant accepting whatever consequences followed, and she was prepared to face whatever came next. The airport security officers approached with the measured pace of professionals who had dealt with countless disturbances, but recognized that the situation was different from the typical gate delays or baggage disputes they usually handled. The lead officer, a tall woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, surveyed the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who could read crowd dynamics and potential threats in seconds. Officer Martinez had been working airport security for 15 years, long enough to recognize when a situation was about to escalate beyond simple crowd control. She could see the phones recording, could identify at least one face that she knew would make this incident significant beyond the terminal walls, and could sense the tension radiating from the central figures in ways that suggested this confrontation was far from over. Behind her, Officer Chen kept his hand near his radio while maintaining a respectful distance. Both officers had been briefed on de-escalation techniques and understood that their approach in the next few minutes could determine whether this situation resolved quietly or exploded into something that would dominate news cycles for days. Acosta noticed their approach immediately, his media instincts causing him to quickly assess how their presence might affect his narrative, rather than showing concern about potential consequences. For his behavior, his eyes lit up with what appeared to be excitement about the additional dramatic elements being added to his impromptu production. "Perfect timing," he said, raising his voice to ensure the officers could hear him clearly while keeping his camera rolling. "Officers, I'm glad you're here. I've been trying to address a service issue, and now I'm being harassed by this woman who apparently thinks she can intimidate me into silence." The accusation was delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling narratives, but Officer Martinez had dealt with enough manipulative individuals to recognize the tactic. She observed Acosta's aggressive posture, his phone pointed like a weapon, and the obvious distress of everyone else involved before making any assumptions about who might be the actual problem. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your phone and step back from the counter," she said in a voice that carried authority without aggression. "We've received reports about a disturbance, and I need to understand what's happening here." Acosta's response was immediate and predictably confrontational. "A disturbance? I'm practicing journalism. Officer, I have a First Amendment right to document poor service and hold people accountable. If that disturbs people, perhaps they should examine why they're uncomfortable with transparency." His words were carefully chosen, invoking constitutional protections and professional privileges that he clearly hoped would complicate any attempt by security to restrict his behavior. But Officer Martinez had heard similar arguments from other individuals who tried to use their professions or platforms to justify disruptive conduct. "Sir, the First Amendment doesn't protect harassment or intimidation," she replied calmly. "And right now, I need you to comply with my request to step back and lower your recording device so we can have a conversation about what's been happening here." The standoff that followed was electric with tension. Acosta clearly wanted to continue recording, to capture whatever interaction might unfold with security, while the officers needed to establish control over a situation that was threatening to spiral. completely out of hand. Meanwhile, Pam remained positioned between Acosta and the coffee counter, her presence serving as a protective barrier for Sarah, who was still visibly shaken by the entire ordeal. "Officer," Pam said, her voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of someone accustomed to addressing authority figures. "I witnessed this entire situation from the beginning. This gentleman has been harassing this young woman for approximately 20 minutes, recording her without consent, making personal attacks, and creating a hostile work environment. She's clearly distressed, and his behavior has gone far beyond any reasonable customer complaint." Her statement was delivered with the precision of someone who understood how to present facts clearly and persuasively. But Acosta immediately seized on her intervention as further evidence of what he was characterizing as an orchestrated attack on his rights. "There it is," he declared, swinging his camera toward Pam while addressing both the officers and his future audience. "Coordination between former Trump officials and airport security to silence legitimate journalism. This is exactly the kind of authoritarian behavior that the American people need to see." The conspiracy theory was absurd on its face, but Acosta delivered it with such conviction that some of the onlookers began murmuring among themselves, uncertain about what they were witnessing. Officer Martinez recognized that the situation was becoming more complex by the moment, with political undertones that could easily overshadow the simple matter of someone harassing a service worker. "Sir, this isn't about politics or journalism," she said firmly. "This is about your behavior toward that young woman behind the counter. I need you to turn off your camera and explain what happened here without the performance." The word performance clearly stung, and Acosta's professional composure cracked slightly. His face reddened, and his voice took on a sharper edge that revealed the anger beneath his calculated presentation. "Performance," he repeated, his tone becoming more aggressive. "I'm documenting the decline of basic competency in American service industries. I'm showing people what happens when standards disappear and mediocrity becomes acceptable. That's not performance, that's public service." Officer Chen stepped forward slightly, his presence adding weight to his partner's attempts to de-escalate the situation. He had been observing the body language of everyone involved and could see that Acosta's agitation was increasing rather than decreasing. "Despite the clear presence of authority figures, Mr. Acosta," he said, recognizing the correspondent and using his name deliberately, "we understand that you may have had a legitimate complaint about service, but the way you've chosen to address it has created a disturbance that's affecting other passengers and causing distress to the employee. We need to find a way to resolve this that doesn't involve continued harassment." The acknowledgement of his identity seemed to energize Acosta rather than calm him. He straightened his shoulders and adopted the posture he typically used during confrontational press conferences, clearly viewing this interaction as another opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to aggressive journalism. "Officer Chen," he said, reading the name tag with obvious satisfaction, "I appreciate that you recognize me, which means you understand the importance of press freedom in our democracy. What you're witnessing here isn't harassment, it's accountability journalism. And any attempt to silence that journalism is a direct attack on the First Amendment." The grandiose language and constitutional invocations were clearly designed to make the officers hesitant about taking any action that might be characterized as suppressing press freedom. But Officer Martinez had dealt with enough individuals who tried to hide behind professional privileges to recognize the tactic. "Mr. Acosta, with respect, you're not at a press conference or covering a political event. You're in a coffee shop, harassing a young woman who is trying to do her job. The First Amendment doesn't give you the right to create a hostile work environment or to intimidate service workers." Her words were delivered with the patient firmness of someone who understood legal principles but wasn't intimidated by attempts to misapply them. The distinction she drew between legitimate journalism and harassment was clear and legally sound. But Acosta clearly had no intention of accepting it. "Hostile work environment," he scoffed, his voice rising again. "I asked for a simple modification to my coffee order. When it was prepared incorrectly, I pointed out the mistake. When the employee became defensive and unprofessional, I documented the interaction. That's not harassment, that's holding people accountable for their performance. Pam had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration, watching. Acosta continued to distort the facts even in the presence of security officers, who were trying to resolve the situation peacefully. She could see Sarah still crying behind the counter, could see the crowd of onlookers recording every moment, and could feel the weight of a situation that was spinning further out of control. With each passing minute, "That's not what happened," she said, her voice cutting through Acosta's self-justification with prosecutorial clarity. "I watched the entire interaction. This young woman prepared what appeared to be a perfectly acceptable coffee drink. When you decided it wasn't exactly what you wanted, instead of asking politely for an adjustment, you began berating her personally. You called her incompetent, questioned her intelligence, and then started recording her distress for your own entertainment." Her recounting of the events was precise and damning, delivered with the authority of someone who had spent years presenting evidence in courtrooms. But rather than acknowledging the accuracy of her account, Acosta immediately went on the offensive, attacking both her credibility and her motives. "Officers, what you're hearing is a completely biased account from someone with a clear political agenda," he declared, pointing his camera at Pam while addressing the security personnel. Pam Bondi is a former Trump loyalist who has spent years attacking the free press. Her intervention here isn't about protecting anyone. It's about silencing criticism and controlling the narrative. The personal attack was clearly designed to discredit her testimony by making it about partisan politics rather than observable facts. But Officer Martinez had been watching the interaction carefully and had her own assessment of what had transpired. "Sir, regardless of anyone's political affiliations, I can see a distressed employee, a crowd of upset passengers, and a situation that needs to be resolved immediately," she said. "Your characterization of events doesn't change the fact that your behavior has created a disturbance that requires our intervention." The officer's refusal to be drawn into political arguments seemed to frustrate Acosta further. He was accustomed to being able to frame confrontations in ideological terms that would rally his supporters and put his opponents on the defensive. But the security officers were focused solely on the immediate situation and the practical need to restore order to their terminal. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on a tone of martyred defiance. "If you want to suppress journalism and protect incompetence, that's your choice. But the American people will see exactly what happened here. They'll see how criticism gets silenced and how accountability gets suppressed when it becomes inconvenient for the powerful." He raised his phone higher, clearly intending to continue recording despite the officer's requests, and took a step closer to both Pam and the security personnel. The movement was aggressive and confrontational, designed to provoke a response that he could then characterize as excessive force or authoritarian overreach. Officer Chen recognized the provocation for what it was and responded with practiced professionalism. "Mr. Acosta, I'm going to ask you one more time to turn off your camera and step back. If you continue to refuse, we'll have to consider this disorderly conduct and take appropriate action." The threat was delivered calmly but clearly, giving Acosta final opportunity to de-escalate the situation voluntarily. But rather than accepting the warning, he seemed to view it as validation of his narrative about authoritarian suppression of press freedom. "There it is," he announced triumphantly, swinging his camera to capture both officers in the frame. "Threats against a journalist for doing his job. This is exactly what press freedom advocates have been warning about. The erosion of constitutional rights happening in real time, captured on video for everyone to see." His dramatic pronouncement was clearly intended to rally support from any viewers who might later see his recording, but it also marked the point where the situation moved beyond verbal confrontation into active defiance of law enforcement instructions. Officer Martinez recognized that they had reached the limit of de-escalation options. "Sir, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct and harassment," she said, reaching for her handcuffs with the calm efficiency of someone who had made countless arrests. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." The words seemed to electrify the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the onlookers as phones captured every moment of what was clearly becoming a significant incident. Acosta's eyes widened with what appeared to be a mixture of shock and excitement, as if he couldn't quite believe that the situation had escalated to the point of actual arrest. "You're arresting a journalist for practicing journalism," he demanded, his voice rising to a near shout. "This is exactly what happens in authoritarian regimes. This is exactly what the founders warned us about when they wrote the First Amendment." But even as he protested, Acosta made no move to comply with the officer's instructions. Instead, he continued holding his phone up, recording his own arrest while delivering what amounted to a running commentary on the constitutional implications of his situation. Officer Chen moved to assist his partner, approaching from Acosta's other side to ensure that the arrest could be completed safely and efficiently. The presence of two officers seemed to finally convince Acosta that this was not a bluff or a negotiating tactic, but a serious law enforcement action with real consequences. "This is outrageous," he continued, his voice becoming more shrill as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "I'm being arrested for asking for proper coffee service. I'm being silenced for pointing out incompetence. This is everything that's wrong with America today." His characterization of events bore little resemblance to what had actually transpired, but Officer Martinez was focused on completing the arrest safely, rather than debating the facts with someone who clearly had no interest in acknowledging them. "Sir, please turn around and place your hands behind your back," she repeated, her voice remaining calm despite Acosta's increasing agitation. "You can explain your version of events to the judge, but right now I need you to comply with my instructions." The crowd around them had grown significantly larger, drawn by the commotion and the sight of a recognizable public figure being arrested. Phones continued to record from multiple angles, ensuring that whatever happened next would be documented and disseminated across social media within minutes. Pam watched the unfolding arrest with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She was glad that Acosta's harassment of Sarah was finally being addressed by appropriate authorities, but she also understood that his arrest would likely generate significant controversy and media attention that could overshadow the original issue of his misconduct. Sarah, meanwhile, had finally been able to step away from her position behind the counter, supported by a manager who had appeared during the confrontation with security. The young woman was still visibly shaken, but the immediate threat to her safety and dignity had been removed by the officer's intervention. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said to Pam while maintaining her focus on Acosta, "we're going to need you to provide a statement about what you witnessed here. Can you wait for us at the security office?" Pam nodded, understanding that her role as a witness would be crucial in documenting the events that had led to Acosta's arrest. She gathered her briefcase and prepared to follow the officers, but not before taking one last look at Sarah to ensure that the young woman was receiving appropriate support. As Officer Chen moved to complete the handcuffing procedure, Acosta made one final attempt to resist, pulling away from the officers while continuing to hold his phone aloft. The movement was clearly intended to create a dramatic moment for his recording, but it also constituted active resistance to arrest. "I will not be silenced," he shouted, his voice echoing through the terminal as more passengers stopped to watch the spectacle. "I will not allow journalism to be criminalized. The American people deserve to know what really happened here." His defiance was short-lived, however, as both officers quickly and professionally secured his arms behind his back, finally separating him from his phone and ending his ability to continue recording his own arrest. The device clattered to the floor, where Officer Chen carefully retrieved it as potential evidence. The sight of the famous CNN correspondent being led away in handcuffs created a buzz of excitement and conversation throughout the terminal. Some passengers cheered, apparently viewing his arrest as justified consequences for his behavior, while others seemed concerned about the implications for press freedom and First Amendment rights. Pam followed the officers toward the security office, her mind already working through the legal and political ramifications of what had just occurred. She knew that Acosta's arrest would become a major news story, that his version of events would be broadcast across multiple platforms, and that the actual facts of his harassment might be obscured by the larger narrative about journalism and constitutional rights. But as she glanced back at Sarah, who was being comforted by her co-workers and seemed to be slowly recovering from her ordeal. Pam felt confident that she had made the right choice in intervening. Sometimes protecting the vulnerable required accepting the complexity and controversy that followed, and she was prepared to face whatever consequences emerged from this confrontation. The walk to the security office was surreal, with passengers continuing to record and comment on the unprecedented scene they had just witnessed. Pam could hear fragments of conversation speculating about what would happen next, whether Acosta's arrest would hold up in court, and how the incident would be portrayed in the media. As they reached the security office, Officer Martinez paused to address the crowd that had followed them. "The situation has been resolved," she announced. "Please return to your normal activities and allow us to complete our investigation." The crowd began to disperse slowly, with many passengers clearly reluctant to miss any additional developments. But the immediate crisis had passed, order had been restored to the terminal, and the young woman who had been the original target of harassment was finally safe from further abuse. Inside the security office, Pam prepared to provide her detailed account of the events that had led to this extraordinary conclusion. She knew that her testimony would be scrutinized and challenged, that her political background would be used to question her credibility, and that the simple act of protecting an innocent person would be transformed into something far more complex and controversial. But as she sat down to begin her statement, Pam reflected on the lesson her father had taught her about the nature of justice. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting the complications that followed, and sometimes protecting the powerless required standing up to those who abused their privilege and platform. The events of this morning had started with a simple desire for a quiet flight, and had ended with one of the most recognizable faces in journalism being arrested for harassment. It was not the outcome anyone could have predicted, but it was the consequence of choices made by individuals who either chose to abuse their power or chose to stand up against that abuse. As she began to recount the details of Acosta's harassment campaign against Sarah, Pam knew that this story was far from over. The arrest would generate headlines, legal challenges, and political commentary that would continue for weeks or months. But at the center of all that noise would remain a simple truth. When someone with power and privilege chooses to harm someone without those advantages, there must be people willing to intervene, regardless of the personal cost. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the security office, creating the same sterile atmosphere that had surrounded the morning's events. But for Pam, sitting in that small room preparing to defend her actions and protect Sarah's dignity, the light felt warmer, more purposeful, illuminated by the knowledge that she had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. The security office at Denver International Airport had seen its share of difficult situations over the years, but the atmosphere this morning carried a weight that even the most experienced personnel could feel. Officer Martinez sat across from Pam at a small metal table, her digital recorder positioned between them, while Officer Chen completed the paperwork related to Acosta's arrest in an adjacent room. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in stark relief, creating shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what had just transpired. Pam had given her initial statement, a precise and detailed account of the events that had led to the confrontation. Her legal training showed in the way she organized the timeline, identified specific behaviors, and distinguished between observable facts and subjective interpretations. But Officer Martinez could sense that there was more to this story than just the immediate incident, that the implications of what had occurred would extend far beyond a simple harassment charge. "Ms. Bondi," Officer Martinez said, reviewing her notes, "I want to make sure I understand the sequence of events clearly. You observed Mr. Acosta's interaction with the barista for approximately 20 minutes before you intervened." Pam nodded, her expression thoughtful as she recalled the progression of the morning's events. "I was working at my gate when I first noticed the commotion. Initially, I assumed it was a typical customer service issue, but as I watched, it became clear that his behavior was escalating beyond any reasonable complaint. The young woman was obviously distressed, and he was recording her distress rather than trying to resolve whatever issue he claimed to have." The officer made additional notes, understanding that the timeline and escalation pattern would be crucial if formal charges were filed. But she was also aware that this case would likely receive scrutiny that went far beyond normal harassment prosecutions, given the public figures involved and the potential First Amendment implications that Acosta would undoubtedly raise in his defense. When you approached the situation, what was your primary concern? Officer Martinez asked, genuinely curious about what had motivated a former attorney general to involve herself in what could have been dismissed as a minor service dispute. Pam considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would likely be examined and analyzed by countless observers in the coming days and weeks. My primary concern was for Sarah's well-being, she said finally. I could see that she was being subjected to harassment that was causing her genuine distress, and no one else was intervening. Sometimes you reach a point where you have to choose between your own comfort and another person's safety. The answer revealed something about Pam's character that went beyond her public persona or political affiliations. Officer Martinez had dealt with enough situations involving powerful people to recognize when someone was motivated by genuine concern rather than political calculation or personal gain. Before she could ask her next question, Officer Chen appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested new complications had emerged. Martinez, we need to talk, he said, his tone carrying the urgency of someone who had just received concerning information. Officer Martinez excused herself and stepped into the hallway with her partner, leaving Pam alone with her thoughts for the first time since the confrontation had begun. The silence in the small room felt profound after the chaos of the terminal, but it also provided an opportunity for reflection on what had just occurred and what might happen next. She knew that Acosta's arrest would generate immediate media attention, that his network would likely frame the incident as an attack on press freedom, and that her own involvement would be scrutinized through every possible political lens. The simple act of protecting a young service worker would be transformed into something far more complex and controversial, with implications that neither she nor anyone else could fully predict. But as she sat in that sterile office, Pam felt a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in years of public service. For once, her actions had been motivated purely by the desire to do what was right, without calculation about political consequences or public perception. She had seen someone being harmed and had chosen to intervene, accepting whatever complications might follow. Officer Martinez returned after several minutes, her expression more serious than before. Ms. Bondi, I need to inform you that Mr. Acosta's legal team has already been contacted, and there are media representatives gathering outside the terminal. The situation is going to receive significant public attention, and your involvement will likely be a major focus of that coverage. Pam nodded, having expected as much. I understand. Officer, I'm prepared to stand by my statement and my actions. If testifying or providing additional information becomes necessary, I'm willing to do whatever is required. The commitment was delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years navigating complex legal and political situations. But Officer Martinez could also detect an underlying tension, the awareness that this incident would likely become a defining moment in how Pam was perceived by the public and remembered by history. There's something else, Officer Martinez continued, consulting her notes. The coffee shop manager finally appeared after Mr. Acosta was taken into custody. She confirmed that there was no legitimate complaint about service, that Sarah had prepared the order exactly as requested, and that Mr. Acosta became agitated when she explained that certain modifications weren't possible with their equipment. This information confirmed what Pam had suspected from her observations, that Acosta's entire narrative about incompetent service and justified criticism had been fabricated to create content and controversy. The revelation strengthened the harassment case considerably, but also highlighted the calculated nature of his behavior toward an innocent young woman. How is Sarah doing? Pam asked, genuinely concerned about the lasting impact of the morning's events on someone who had simply been trying to do her job. She's shaken, but her manager is providing support, and employee assistance counselors are being brought in. Officer Martinez replied, she wanted me to thank you for intervening. She said she didn't know how to make it stop. and she was afraid it would get worse if she tried to defend herself. The gratitude from Sarah meant more to Pam than any political victory or legal triumph she had ever achieved. Knowing that her intervention had protected someone vulnerable from further harm validated every risk she had taken in choosing to get involved. Officer Chen reappeared in the doorway, this time with news that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. "The airport administration wants to meet with Ms. Bondi," he announced. "Apparently, this incident has raised concerns about passenger safety and employee protection that go beyond the immediate criminal charges." Pam understood immediately that the airport's interest represented both an opportunity and a potential complication. Her involvement had highlighted systemic issues about how service workers were protected from harassment and how institutions responded when powerful individuals abused their platforms to harm others. The walk through the terminal to the administrative offices provided Pam with her first glimpse of how the story was already being received by the public. Passengers who recognized her offered words of support, thanking her for standing up to what they characterized as bullying behavior. Others seemed more skeptical, questioning whether her intervention had been appropriate or whether it represented some form of political theater. The airport's senior management had assembled in a conference room that overlooked the main terminal, providing a bird's-eye view of the location where the morning's events had unfolded. Director Patricia Hawkins, a veteran administrator who had overseen the airport's operations for more than a decade, greeted Pam with the professional courtesy of someone who understood the complexity of the situation they were now facing together. "Ms. Bondi, thank you for coming," Director Hawkins said, gesturing toward a chair at the polished conference table. "I want to begin by expressing our gratitude for your intervention this morning. What you witnessed and reported has helped us understand serious gaps in our procedures for protecting employees from harassment." The acknowledgement was significant, representing an institutional recognition that Acosta's behavior had indeed constituted harassment, rather than legitimate journalism or customer feedback. But Pam could also sense that the airport administration was grappling with larger questions about how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Director Hawkins, "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this situation," Pam replied. "What I witnessed this morning shouldn't happen to anyone in their workplace, regardless of whether cameras are involved or public figures are present. Sarah deserved better protection, and I hope we can find ways to ensure that other employees don't face similar harassment." The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which the incident had exposed vulnerabilities in how service workers were protected from aggressive customers. The airport had policies prohibiting harassment and disorderly conduct, but they had never been tested against someone who claimed journalistic privilege and constitutional protection for their behavior. "We're implementing immediate changes to our training and response protocols," Director Hawkins explained. "Managers will be empowered to intervene more quickly when employees are being harassed, and security will be alerted automatically when certain escalation thresholds are reached." The policy changes represented a positive outcome from the morning's events, but they also highlighted how many service workers had probably endured similar treatment without anyone with Pam's background and authority being present to intervene on their behalf. As the meeting concluded, Director Hawkins raised a concern that had been weighing on airport management since news of the incident began spreading. "Ms. Bondi, we're anticipating significant media attention about this incident. Mr. Acosta's network has already issued preliminary statements characterizing his arrest as an attack on press freedom. How do you think we should respond to that narrative?" Pam considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would influence how the airport positioned itself in what was likely to become a national conversation about journalism, harassment, and the limits of constitutional protection for disruptive behavior. "I think the response should be simple and factual," she said finally. "Mr. Acosta wasn't arrested for practicing journalism. He was arrested for harassing an employee and creating a disturbance. The First Amendment doesn't protect harassment, intimidation, or the deliberate creation of hostile work environments. If his behavior had occurred in any other context, without cameras or claims of journalistic purpose, everyone would recognize it as unacceptable." The distinction was crucial, and Director Hawkins nodded her understanding. The airport would need to defend its actions and its employees without being drawn into broader political debates about media freedom or constitutional interpretation. By the time Pam emerged from the administrative offices, the story had already begun to take on a life of its own in the digital sphere. Social media platforms were buzzing with videos from multiple angles, competing narratives about what had occurred, and heated debates about everything from journalism ethics to the treatment of service workers. CNN had issued a statement defending Acosta's actions and condemning his arrest as a dangerous precedent for press freedom in America. The network characterized the incident as harassment of a journalist by airport security at the behest of a Trump loyalist who sought to silence legitimate reporting about service industry standards. But other voices were emerging to challenge that narrative. Labor rights organizations praised Pam's intervention as an example of protecting vulnerable workers from harassment. Legal experts questioned whether Acosta's behavior qualified for First Amendment protection, and service industry workers shared their own stories of harassment and abuse that rarely received media attention. The competing narratives created a complex media environment where the simple facts of what had occurred were being overshadowed by larger ideological battles. Pam understood that her role in the incident would be analyzed through every possible political lens, but she also knew that the truth of what had happened would ultimately speak for itself. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, political allies, and legal advisors, but she had chosen not to respond to any of them immediately. The morning's events deserved thoughtful consideration rather than reactive statements, and she wanted to ensure that any public comments she made focused on the core issues, rather than getting drawn into partisan debates. As she finally prepared to board her delayed flight to Phoenix, Pam received a text message that brought the morning's events into sharp personal focus. It was from Sarah, the young barista who had been at the center of the controversy, sent through the airport's Employee Assistance Program Coordinator. "Ms. Bondi, I wanted to thank you for what you did this morning. I was so scared and didn't know how to make it stop. You probably saved my job and maybe more than that. I'm studying criminal justice at the University of Colorado, and seeing you stand up for what's right has inspired me to keep working toward becoming a prosecutor myself. Thank you for showing me that there are people who will fight for others even when it's difficult." The message brought tears to Pam's eyes, reminding her why she had chosen to intervene despite the potential consequences. Sarah's gratitude and inspiration represented the real impact of the morning's events. Beyond all the political noise and media speculation that would inevitably follow, as her flight was finally called for boarding, Pam reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun the day seeking anonymity and quiet preparation for a legal conference, but had instead found herself at the center of a national conversation about power, privilege, and the responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The flight to Phoenix provided time for deeper reflection on the broader implications of what had occurred. Acosta's arrest would likely be challenged in court, with First Amendment scholars and press freedom advocates arguing that his behavior was protected speech. The case would probably become a test of where society drew the lines between legitimate journalism and harassment, between constitutional protection and basic human decency. But regardless of how the legal proceedings unfolded, Pam knew that the morning's events had revealed something important about the current state of public discourse. Too often, people with platforms and privilege felt entitled to treat others as props in their personal narratives, to create content out of human suffering, and to hide behind professional or constitutional claims when challenged about their behavior. The young woman who had been harassed deserved better than to become a symbol in ideological battles she never chose to join. The service workers who faced similar treatment every day deserved protection that didn't depend on the chance presence of someone with legal training and public standing. And society as a whole deserved better models of how to address disagreements and frustrations without dehumanizing those who lacked power to fight back. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Pam opened her laptop and began drafting a statement that she would release later that evening. She wanted to ensure that her perspective on the morning's events was clearly articulated before the story became completely dominated by political interpretations and media spin. This morning, I witnessed harassment masquerading as journalism. She began, "What happened in that Denver airport wasn't about press freedom or political ideology. It was about a powerful person with a platform choosing to humiliate someone who was simply trying to do her job. When I saw that young woman's distress, I couldn't stand by and watch it continue." She paused, considering how to address the inevitable criticism that her intervention had been politically motivated. "I understand that my involvement will be viewed through a political lens, and that some will question my motives based on my background and associations. But I would ask those critics to consider this. If your daughter or sister or friend was being treated the way Sarah was treated this morning, would you want someone to intervene? Would you care about the politics of the person who stepped forward to help?" The statement continued with a broader reflection on the responsibilities that came with public platforms and media influence. Those of us who have been given voices in the public sphere have an obligation to use those voices responsibly. That means treating others with dignity, especially those who don't have equivalent platforms to defend themselves. It means recognizing that real people can be harmed when their distress becomes someone else's content. She concluded with a call for better protection of service workers and a renewed commitment to civil discourse. Sarah's experience this morning shouldn't be unusual enough to make national news. Too many workers face harassment and abuse that goes unnoticed and unaddressed. We need better systems to protect vulnerable employees, and we need to recommit ourselves to treating each other with basic human respect, regardless of our differences or disagreements. The statement was carefully crafted to focus on the core issues while acknowledging the political realities that would inevitably shape public perception of the incident. Pam knew that it wouldn't satisfy her critics or prevent the story from being used as ammunition in broader cultural and political battles, but she hoped it might refocus attention on the human elements that had motivated her intervention. By the time her flight landed in Phoenix, the story had exploded across traditional and social media platforms. Cable news networks were running segments about press freedom and political harassment. Legal experts were debating the constitutional implications of Acosta's arrest, and social media users were sharing their own experiences with workplace harassment and public humiliation. The responses revealed deep divisions in how Americans viewed the incident, with reactions often following along predictable political and ideological lines. But there were also surprising moments of consensus, with people across the political spectrum expressing sympathy for Sarah and criticism of Acosta's behavior toward a young service worker. The legal proceedings that would follow Acosta's arrest promised to be complex and contentious. His legal team had already indicated their intention to challenge the charges on First Amendment grounds, arguing that his arrest represented government censorship of legitimate journalism. Press freedom organizations were mobilizing to support his case, viewing it as a crucial test of constitutional protections for aggressive reporting. But prosecutors were confident that the charges would hold up under scrutiny. The evidence clearly showed harassment and intimidation that went far beyond any reasonable definition of protected speech. Video from multiple angles documented Acosta's aggressive behavior, and witness statements confirmed the distress he had caused to the coffee shop employee. More importantly, the incident had sparked broader conversations about workplace harassment, the responsibilities of public figures, and the limits of constitutional protection for disruptive behavior. Labor organizations used the case to highlight the vulnerability of service workers to abuse from customers who felt entitled to treat them poorly. Universities began incorporating the incident into journalism ethics courses, using it as a case study in the difference between legitimate reporting and harassment. Legal scholars debated the boundaries of First Amendment protection and the point at which behavior became so disruptive that constitutional claims couldn't shield it from consequences. For Sarah, the young barista who had inadvertently become the center of national attention, the aftermath of the incident was both overwhelming and inspiring. The support she received from strangers across the country validated her experience and provided encouragement for her continued studies in criminal justice. She declined most interview requests, preferring to focus on her education and her recovery from the traumatic experience. But in a brief statement released through her university, she expressed gratitude for the support she had received and hoped that her experience might lead to better protection for other service workers. I never expected to become part of a national conversation about harassment and journalism, she said. But if my experience helps other people understand what it's like to be targeted by someone with power and a platform, then maybe something positive can come from what happened to me. The statement reflected a maturity and perspective that impressed observers and added another layer of sympathy for someone who had simply been trying to work her way through college when she became the target of harassment. As weeks passed and the legal proceedings moved forward, the incident continued to generate discussion and analysis. Some media outlets conducted investigations into Acosta's past interactions with service workers and ordinary citizens, finding a pattern of aggressive behavior that often went unreported because the targets lacked platforms to defend themselves. Others focused on the broader implications for press freedom and the potential chilling effect that harassment charges might have on aggressive journalism. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about where society should draw lines between protected speech and harmful behavior. For Pam, the incident became a defining moment that reminded her why she had entered public service in the first place. The opportunity to protect someone vulnerable from harm had been worth every complication and controversy that followed. She had demonstrated that sometimes the most important stands were taken not in legislative chambers or courtrooms, but in ordinary moments when ordinary people needed someone to speak up for them. The ripple effects of that single morning in Denver International Airport continued to spread, influencing conversations about journalism ethics, workplace protection, and the responsibilities that came with public platforms. It had shown that individual actions could still matter in an age of institutional dysfunction, and that standing up for basic human dignity remained both necessary and possible. Sarah completed her degree in criminal justice and went on to law school, inspired by the experience of seeing someone advocate for her when she couldn't advocate for herself. She specialized in employment law and victim advocacy, carrying forward the lesson that protecting the vulnerable required people willing to accept the risks that came with intervention. The coffee shop where the incident occurred became an unlikely symbol of workplace dignity, with the airport installing new policies and training programs designed to protect employees from harassment. Sarah's manager reported that the changes created a safer and more supportive environment for all workers, demonstrating that positive change could emerge from even the most challenging circumstances. And in airports across the country, service workers gained new protections and support systems that recognized their vulnerability to harassment from customers who felt entitled to treat them poorly. The incident had highlighted a widespread problem that had been largely invisible to those who didn't experience it directly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.